Hi, I'm Susan Dudley, Director of the George Washington University Regulatory Studies Center and Professor in the Trachtenberg School of Public Policy and Public Administration. In partnership with the OECD, Business at OECD, Google, the World Economic Forum, and the U.S. Council for International Business, we are very pleased to bring you this video recording of the symposium on Agile Governance for Our Future, Reimagining Regulation to Support Innovation. The George Washington University is just steps from the White House, the State Department, the World Bank, and Congress, so it attracts students and faculty interested in international affairs, political science, law, economics, public policy, and public administration. Relevant to our discussion today, the Trachtenberg School is the only top-ranked public affairs school in the country where students can concentrate in regulatory policy. GW is also a training ground for those interested in innovation in medicine, engineering, physical sciences, and more. For example, our School of Engineering and Applied Sciences recently received a $3 million award from the National Science Foundation to develop a transformative model for graduate education training that combines research in computer science and systems engineering to support the next generation of leaders and researchers in artificial intelligence. GW's I-Corps program is part of a major mid-Atlantic hub working to boost regional innovation by translating research into action. Our Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics helps the public, journalists, and policymakers understand digital media's influence on public dialogue and opinion, and works to develop sound solutions to disinformation and other ills that can arise. And faculty in our physics department are using big data and network analysis to map how content spreads online across popular platforms. On behalf of all our speakers and organizers, we thank you for tuning into this symposium, and we hope you find the day's conversations as exciting and thought-provoking as we did.
We are pleased to be involved in this conversation on how to ensure that government policies are agile enough to keep up with evolving technologies and business practices. Technological innovation can be a powerful force for good. Thanks to the rapid development of vaccines, we're able to meet here in person after a challenging 2 years. Technology kept us connected during the pandemic, delivering not only groceries, but humanitarian aid, and it's contributing to economic development and growth and recovery. But rapid technological change also brings risks and raises questions about whether existing government practices are agile enough to realize the opportunities and mitigate the potential perils of rapid innovation. Precautionary policies may hinder welfare improving innovation and inadvertently increase risk and reduce overall well-being. But in dynamic and evolving areas, regulators often don't have enough information to conduct formal analyses of regulatory benefits and costs needed to evaluate trade-offs. That's why we see an increased interest internationally in what we're calling agile governance that uses dynamic, flexible, and iterative regulatory principles and embraces a learning agenda, taking advantage of natural experiments and adapting quickly to new information. Agile governance also requires a level of humility, willingness to admit error and pivot in light of changing information, transparency with respect to uncertainties and steps being taken to reduce them, and an openness to different perspectives, disciplines, and evidence. So our objective today is to support high-impact dialogue on these important topics. Our co-host, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, has led some of these efforts. Last fall, it issued recommendations on Agile Regulatory Governance. So I would like to, before we go further, introduce Jeffrey Schlagenhoff, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, for some brief welcoming remarks. You can find his distinguished bio on our event page. So let me just say that he's an American joining us from Paris. And before joining the OECD, he held senior positions in the US Office of Management and Budget and Congressional Joint Economic Committee, as well as in the private sector. Jeffrey.
Susan, good to see you, even if only virtually. We haven't worked together directly in the past, but our paths have crossed many times, dating back to your time at the CFTC back in the 1980s. It's my great pleasure to give you and everyone here a warm welcome to this public symposium, Agile Governance for Our Future, which is co-organized by the George Washington University Business at the OECD and the OECD with support from the United States Council for International Business and Google. A special thanks goes to all our partners in this event for their valuable cooperation. As a matter of fact, had my presence not been required at an OECD Council meeting tomorrow, I would have traveled to DC in order to be with you there in person today, the topic at hand being particularly relevant and close to my heart. I want to reflect on the thread running through the OECD's work on regulation in recent years, which is at the core of today's event, namely the idea of transforming the way governments make and enforce rules. Adaptability and agility are increasingly important components of what makes an effective regulatory system. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a stark reminder of this. It required governments to respond quickly to urgent health issues and have flexible regulatory systems in place to aid this response. The pandemic has also underlined the need for rulemaking systems that enable the development of socially beneficial innovations, such as new treatments and vaccines, and more generally to enhance resilience and preparedness in crisis situations. Transforming rulemaking is key to both manage and promote the increasingly important role of innovation in our societies and our economies. There is no denying that innovation and technological change are provoking changes that are unprecedented in view of their pace, scope, and complexity. If well governed, these innovations can result in substantial welfare gains. However, innovation also raises profound governance and regulatory challenges for governments across the world who are struggling to keep pace, while simultaneously trying to support growth and innovation and protect citizens and the environment. In this context, governance and regulatory frameworks that are not fit for the future will result in ineffective policy interventions, curb innovations, fail to afford protection, and ultimately undermine trust in government. This event is timely. Last October, the OECD Council adopted a recommendation for Agile Regulatory Governance to harness innovation, whose contribution has been acknowledged in the last declaration of the G20 digital ministers. This recommendation aims to help policymakers design and implement agile and resilient regulatory approaches that unlock the potential of innovation while safeguarding public protections. It complements previous OECD work in this field, such as the recommendation on artificial intelligence and the recommendation on responsible innovation in neurotechnology. The adoption of the recommendations for Agile Regulatory Governance to harness innovation creates momentum for regulatory reform towards more agile and forward-looking approaches to innovation. We now move into the implementation stage. This public symposium, which gathers a variety of perspectives and sources of expertise, is therefore an important step to promote the move to action. This will require continuous dialogue and broad-based public and stakeholder engagement. It is indeed my sincere hope that this symposium will help give visibility to the recommendation and encourage buy-in from the broader regulatory community. Events like this can inspire policymakers to bring about changes to implement agile approaches to regulation and address the existing gaps in the regulatory landscape. International regulatory cooperation will be critical for the success on this, and in particular, identifying avenues for strengthening cross-border and cross-agency cooperation in this arena. Let me conclude by thanking you all once again for taking part in this important discussion, which I believe will represent an important contribution to ongoing efforts to enhance regulatory policy and governance so that innovation's potential can be harnessed with a view to driving inclusive and sustainable growth, promoting well-being, and helping address major global challenges. I wish you a very productive dialogue and will make sure I follow up closely on its outcome. Thank you, and I pass the floor back to you, Susan.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks to your OECD team for the groundwork you've laid for this symposium.
We do have a packed agenda today with perspectives from leaders from government, business, academia, and civil society, sharing their experiences with Agile governance and offering perspectives on how we can rethink regulation so that it's fit for purpose now and in the future. Our first speaker needs no introduction, so I'll make mine brief. When I tell people that I served as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs during the Bush administration, I sometimes get rather blank looks. When I say that's the office Cass Sunstein held in the Obama administration, suddenly the light comes on. So to get our conversation started, I'm delighted to welcome Harvard's Robert Walmsley University professor, founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School, and recipient of the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway, Cass Sunstein.
Thank you, Susan, and thanks all. It's great to see you, including friends, dear friends. Hi, Michael Fitzpatrick, amazing public servant and person. Hi to all. A few years ago, I was working on the Defense Innovation Board with some people from Silicon Valley. And in the first meeting, I said with a kind of exhilaration and joy, cost-benefit analysis is the greatest thing. We need more of it. Someone from Silicon Valley, I won't embarrass him by stating his name, but a person of great distinction, looked at me and said, "Oh, Silicon Valley, we don't do cost-benefit analysis." And I was flabbergasted. I thought, this is my effort to make common cause, and what's happening? And I said with genuine befuddlement, what do you do? And he said, "Oh, we test." That's my title, we test. With respect to regulation and its agility, what's the opposite of agility? Rigidity? With respect to regulation and its future, there's a tension between two really important ideas. The first is cost-benefit analysis is really important to proceed on something that involves the environment or energy or highway safety or technology without having a sense of costs and benefits. Am I putting you to sleep? Are you thinking we test? That's a terrible mistake. You need to do that. The second indispensable idea associated with Friedrich Hayek is that information is widely dispersed in society, and that those of us who are privileged to work in government will lack the information that people broadly have, no matter how they work. Hayek emphasized that the multiple failures of plans, both in our individual lives and in our regulatory lives, are a product of a kind of epistemic deficit, which means an absence of information. Terrible question. Are cost-benefit analysts planners? See why that's a terrible question? In a way, they sure are. How can they possibly get the knowledge that would allow them accurately to measure in advance costs and benefits? Sometimes that's really hard. I'm going to suggest 4 reforms can help. The first is an agile government needs less sludge. And we're going to try to explain that less than translucent sentence. The second sentence involves the need to take seriously and modernize the notice and comment process so that the government obtains in real time, to the extent possible, and attends closely to concerns, objections, identification of unintended bad consequences on the part of those who are affected, for better or for worse, by regulatory initiatives. The third involves not retrospective analysis of rules, that's so 2009, but instead continuing analysis of rules, which can produce changes in those rules and lead to improvements in prospective analysis. And the fourth involves testing. We test. So we have actually an acronym, so you'll remember this for the rest of your life. It's the best I can do. The acronym is SCAT, S for sludge, C for comment, A for analysis, and T for testing. SCAT is almost a word, and the suggestion is that's our framework for more agility. Okay. A recent report finds that Americans spend 11.4 billion hours on federal paperwork. An agile government wants to see less of that, whether we're talking about the FCC, the FTC, the EPA, or the Department of Energy. If we value an hour of work at $27, that's probably a lowball figure. We're speaking of the equivalent of north of $300 billion. That's more than double the budget of the Department of State and the Department of Transportation, more than triple that of the Department of Education, and more than 8 times the budget of the Department of Energy. Sludge, understood as administrative burdens, paperwork requirements, long forms, permit requirements, things you have to do to get the government to give you something you're entitled to, or maybe to stop doing something that it's not entitled to do. That level of sludge can impair innovation, impair growth, and insult human dignity. What we need are sludge audits, in which there are regular efforts to catalog the existing level of sludge and to use that to promote sludge reduction. The Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs has recently issued an extremely important guidance document on paperwork burdens, which emphasizes equity and innovation, and it points a path forward. People who are dedicated to economic growth, more in the way of energy innovation, sex equality, poverty reduction, mental health, and racial justice, do not march under colorful big banners containing the word sludge reduction now. But in light of their goals, they ought to do that. Okay, that's the S in the SCAT framework. During and after Roosevelt's New Deal, the US saw a pretty intense debate about government regulation, reminiscent in some ways of the debate that we are now in the midst of. The competing sides were the New Deal enthusiasts, receptive to a larger regulatory state, and New Deal critics, insisting that the new institutions were rigid, not agile, and a betrayal of constitutional ideals. The enduring product of that debate was the Administrative Procedure Act, you know what I'm talking about, yes, which had only one innovation, only one, and that was the notice and comment process for rulemaking. The basic idea was to solicit comments in advance, in part through as a way of promoting legitimacy, but more importantly, more fundamentally, as a way of obtaining information that government would otherwise lack. And the basic idea was to remedy Hayek's problem, maybe to go in the direction of solving it. If government imposes high costs on electricity producers, all sorts of wonderful things might happen. We might have innovation, but we might also see spikes in the cost of electricity, which could be particularly harmful for the poor. If regulators take action to make cars safer, they might find a burst of creativity following that no one anticipated, but they also might make cars more expensive, which might mean fewer people will buy them, which might mean they stick with more dangerous and environmentally less wonderful cars. The most important goal of notice and comment rulemaking and the thing that gives the lie to what I'm about to tell you is a widespread misbelief among law professors. The misinformation, the false news that law professors hold is that notice and comment rulemaking is a fake. It ain't so. When the process is working well, notice and comment rulemaking provides information from technical specialists outside of government, from private associations with distinctive knowledge of particular sectors, and from people with highly localized knowledge which might escape the regulator's attention. What we need now, probably much more than in the 1940s, is a system in which regulatory attention is directed very carefully, all the time, as a routine matter to the information that is provided through notice and comment, with a view toward making corrections before the fact. Okay, continuing analysis, not regulatory analysis. Cost-benefit analysis, and this is my Silicon Valley friends' lack of enthusiasm for cost-benefit analysis, often depends on imperfect, let's say, ex-ante estimates. Sometimes the costs are expected to be 400 million and the benefit 600 million. Sometimes there's a wide range of anticipated benefits and costs. Sometimes the agency is aware of potential unintended bad consequences, but it might think that they're unlikely in the extreme, and that might be too optimistic. Sometimes an agency might not anticipate some very bad thing, which occurs not 5 years after the rule is issued, but 3 months after the rule is issued. What is needed for agile government is a continuing process consistent with feasibility and to the extent permitted by law. By the way, I have to say the words consistent with feasibility and to the extent permitted by law in every set of remarks to make sure that the ex-ante estimates are accurate. Existing knowledge is incomplete. We remain in extremely early stages with respect to continuing evaluation, but there's a lot of data out there, and it does unveil mistakes. Not systematic, but recurrent. One study finds an analysis of 21 health and safety rules that agencies overestimate costs. Regularly, that happens. Not radically and not always, but it happens. In 2005, OIRA provided an overview. That's a long time ago, 2005. We need much more of this and more systematic this. Provided an overview and found that there are systematic errors in the sense of occasionally excessive optimism and occasionally excessive pessimism about what is going to happen on the ground. Agencies typically overestimated benefits and frequently underestimated costs. Not always. The most sensible general conclusion is that agencies are far from unerring, in a tribute to Hayek's statement of the problem. There's no systematic bias in any direction, but there are errors that go both ways. What's important to know is the existing studies cover only a trivially small percentage of the rules on the books, and that retrospective continuing analysis can enable us to fix mistakes in real time. Okay, now we're at the most important part of the remarks, the testing part. Okay, my friend from Silicon Valley was nervous about ex-ante expert projections. Why guess, he urged, why not learn? His claim was we need much more rigorous experimentation, not in the sense of, something in high school, but in the sense of trying to see if we do this regulation, what's exactly going to happen. The central goal of this idea is not to rely on specialist knowledge about likely effects, but to compile evidence, not retrospectively, but in advance or real time. The gold standard here is the idea of randomized controlled trials as a means of learning the effects of policy initiatives. This is very much in early stages. In medicine, of course, it's standard to rely on such trials to know if a drug is safe and effective. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to rely on informed hunches or even to make simple before and after assessments. If we learn that people who use a certain asthma medicine do great after taking the medicine, much better than before, we know something important, but not nearly enough. Before and after assessments don't control for confounding variables. People might be doing better because of some change in the environment that's not adequately understood by those who are making the assessment. In the medical domain, the value of randomized controlled experiments is they have the potential to provide a clear sense of the effects of interventions. A hero of this part of the remarks is Nobel Prize winner Esther Duflo at MIT, who has pioneered with others the use of randomized controlled trials for purposes of policy evaluation. In principle, these trials are the best way to solve the knowledge problem. They provide the closest thing to the gold standard, and in at least some contexts, they should adequately respond to the Hayekian concern that regulations lack information and provide far more in the way of agility. In many cases, small measures have significant impacts, but in the regulatory domain, the use of randomized control trials is in a really preliminary state. Analysis of costs and benefits could be much more informed by them. Okay, to link this with the sludge reduction exercise, there's often an ex-ante estimate of the burdens imposed by an information collection request. That's usually, maybe always, a good faith estimate, but it's not always an accurate estimate. If we ask people to fill out this amount of paperwork or online stuff, what in the number of hours is it actually going to take? It's hard to know. The new OIRA guidance asks to specify that and to be rigorous about it. We could do that much more regularly, not only with information collection requests, but with regulation as a whole. Or we could pilot regulations with, let's say, a stated terminus, where the goal of the stated terminus would be information forcing. So the regulator could say, we've learned in real time that this is dumb, or this is terrific, and we could go forward if it's terrific and stop if it's dumb. An area where randomized controlled trials are especially important is disclosure requirements. Do fuel economy labels have big benefits for consumers? And would other fuel economy labels be better? It would be really good to know. Which kind of fuel economy label produces differences in behavior of what sort? Do people care about environmental factors? How much? The same kinds of questions might be asked about disclosure requirements for credit cards, cell phones, and school loans. With respect to harder forms of regulation, mandates of various sorts, we should increasingly be able to measure in real time what is happening. We can, I suggest, supplement randomized controlled trials by continuing to test the C in the SCAT framework after regulations have been adopted to see where they are failing and what they are actually achieving. If this seems a little pie in the sky, consider just two things. One, in the United Kingdom, the Behavioral Insights team is actually doing this. It is testing in real time regulatory requirements and seeing what works and what doesn't. Duncan Watts, professor at Wharton, has sounded a lot like my colleague from Silicon Valley, insisting that in the private sector, and this won't be news to you exactly, the agility that we observe might be called the measure and react strategy. Many sellers of products acknowledge their limited foresight and their inability to predict consumer and other behavior. Instead of trying, they hire people to test, or algorithms, not quite people, to see what in real time people are doing. On the basis of that information, they can measure and adapt. This is a fast and flexible system in multiple forms. It is big time agile, and it makes it possible to design, produce, and ship new interventions or products all over the world with tremendous speed. Measure and React isn't a randomized controlled trial, but it serves the same functions. It's increasingly used in the private sector, where people know what they don't know and try to adjust on the fly to what people are doing. Can regulators do the same thing? In some contexts, definitely. With respect to security lines at airports, for example, rapid adjustments can be made as the number of travelers varies over time. With respect to traffic fatalities, it's possible to test interventions and monitor diverse situations to test what works and what doesn't. The sky is the limit here. Okay, my focus has been the tension between the indispensability I've urged of ex-ante cost-benefit analysis and Hayek's knowledge problem. I've urged that sludge reduction is crucial, both for enabling regulators to achieve what they need to do and for them to learn. It would be extravagant to contend that notice and comment rulemaking can eliminate the knowledge problem, even in the modern era, but it can produce a lot of help. Retrospective/continuing analysis of regulations is good. Learning in advance and in real time is even better. When regulators are asked a decade from now what they do, here's a hoped for answer: we test. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Cass. All right, next, we'll get an industry perspective from Kent Walker, who is Google's President of Global Affairs and Chief Legal Officer at Google and Alphabet, where he oversees the teams responsible for legal matters, government affairs, content policy, and philanthropy. You can read more about his fascinating career, including that he started one of the first computer crime units as Assistant U.S. Attorney General on our event page. So Kent's going to offer some brief remarks, and then he's going to sit down for a conversation with Ashley Gold, who's a tech and policy reporter covering regulators and big tech at Axios. And then they'll entertain questions from you. And when they do, there's going to be a QR code back here. So people in the room and watching online, you can enter your questions and send them to us, and we'll, I think Ashley and Kent will be able to field them there. So let's start with Mr. Kent Walker.
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to GW and to the OECD for pulling us all together, and thanks to all of you for coming to talk about the idea of agile regulation. There's some folks who might argue that agile regulation is a contradiction in terms, that regulation is by its nature slow and rigid. We don't subscribe to that view. In fact, quite the opposite. We're not only optimistic that regulation can be agile, we think it's essential that regulation become more agile as we start to deal with the digital challenges of the 21st century. So I know that as we stand here today, there are events around the world that are top of mind. It has never been more important for democracies to come together to deal with crises, from the lack of trust in civic institutions, to the ongoing pandemic, to the war in Europe and geopolitical competition. But moments of crises also bring moments of opportunity. If you go back to the origin of the OECD, it started during the Marshall Plan, one of the most ambitious efforts to have global development in history. The OECD itself emerged at the beginning of the Cold War, when democracies were coming together to show that openness could triumph over autocracy. And so while we live in an age of challenges, it's also an opportunity for us to think profoundly about the opportunity for innovation and new ways of approaching these important issues. We all have an opportunity and even a responsibility to take advantage of those moments where we can come together, brought together by crisis perhaps, but brought together in a way that allows us to work constructively for the greater public good. Now, we all may have different perspectives on how best to achieve those goals. This session has been billed as the industry perspective, and you might expect somebody from the tech industry to be here to denounce regulation. Not at all, quite the contrary. We recognize that regulation is important, arguably essential, in building trust across the digital ecosystem, across what's increasingly a digital economy. And while we frequently hear negative stories about regulation, we don't talk enough about when policies have actually gotten it right. And digital policymakers have largely gotten it right. Over the past 100 years, global life expectancy has more than doubled because of advances in science and healthcare, but also because regulators have invested in public health tools and social safety nets. Over the past 30 years, more than 1 billion people have come out of extreme poverty around the world because of trade and technology, but also because regulators invested in modernized trade rules and promoted innovation. So when we look at the urgent challenges of today, whether that's radically reducing our carbon emissions or combating global food shortages or preparing for the next pandemic, it's critical that we build trust in the innovations that we are going to need to solve those problems. Now, each wave of technology is going to bring its own challenges. That's why we come here today not as opposing forces, but as allies with a common goal. We've seen a wave of new regulatory initiatives, which isn't surprising given the pace and the scale and the impact of technological change in the information age, the information revolution. At the heart of many of those initiatives is a simple question. How do we best design governance for the information age? Now, we need to be clear-eyed that there are competing political models. There's a range of regulatory approaches for how we answer that question. And there are trade-offs to any proposed regulatory response. How do we balance and blend important social equities and values like security and privacy, content moderation and free speech, efficiency and competition? In harmonizing those goals, democracies designing governance structures need to keep innovation front of mind. We need to empower people to innovate individually and collectively. Because after all, innovation is the secret weapon of democracy. Democracies provide fertile ground for innovation with the freedom to combine and share knowledge. And innovation repays the favor by raising living standards, which helps give democracies a kind of substantive legitimacy, showing that they work for everyday people. That's why it's great to see innovation as one of the driving forces behind the OECD initiatives on their regulatory policy work. So as we think about what more agile governance might mean, I want to highlight one idea that I think will help us all get it right. And that's the concept of regulatory dialogue. My thesis is that digital innovation requires us to go beyond the era of incremental interaction between the regulated and the regulator. That we need to significantly recalibrate how we engage with each other. Going even beyond the kind of formal notice and comment processes that Cass talked about a moment ago, to having conversations, real conversations about what works and why. If we don't, we risk being out of step with regulations that actually aren't fit for purpose on the long run. Now, regulators are facing a new and unique set of challenges when they're grappling with this seemingly endless stream of digital technologies. Challenges in many ways that have a different flavor than they face in other sectors. Traditional processes may not work well when we're dealing with new digital technologies, technologies used by billions of people that are constantly being updated. Why not? What's different about digital services? I'd argue at least three things. One, the speed of evolution. Second, the variety of different issues that are raised. And third, the inherent tensions and conflicts, both within and between countries. Let me spend a little time on each of those. First, the digital world is highly technical with an unprecedented rate of innovation. Cutting-edge tools from AI to quantum are even more profoundly complex and evolving even more quickly. So regulators and engineers need to talk to each other just to keep up. Second, the digital world is varied. Unlike other sectors, just because two companies both operate online doesn't mean they have similar technologies or business models. Understanding how an enterprise CRM company works doesn't necessarily translate into understanding how a search engine company functions. So regulators need to be prepared to go deep, but businesses also need to be prepared to engage with them just as deeply. And third, the digital world raises new policy questions, often with conflicting social values. So while there's a general consensus that pharma companies should create safe and beneficial drugs, that banks should keep money safe and secure, digital technologies have baked within them tensions and trade-offs between equities like privacy on the one hand and competition on the other, or between free expression and responsible content moderation. And that's just within countries. Different countries bring very different perspectives to all of these questions, draw the lines in very different places. For centuries, each country enforced its own law, reflecting its own cultures, its own norms, and balanced those equities in different ways. The internet, of course, operates on a scale that's both individual and global. So we're now seeing nations reassert some of their traditional regulatory prerogatives. Digital services, of course, have to respect local laws, but also aspire to uphold international norms of human rights. All of this means that it's time to dial up the engagement and the dialogue. Again, it means that companies have to step up and make significant investments in working with regulators on new technologies to ensure that valid concerns are being met. But at the same time, governments need to take the time to learn the details of digital services. That means more technologists in government to help all of us get this right. As one congressman put it a few years ago, it's time to bring in the nerds. And so let me wrap up by sharing 3 quick stories that illustrate why digital is different and maybe help point the way toward how we can engage with each other in a better way. So I'll start with a story from the UK, but it's also a global story, one where the themes and the players will be familiar. So as you probably know, coming from Google, advertising is core to our services. It helps connect businesses and customers, and it supports a free and an open web. We focus on protecting people's privacy. We're concerned about privacy-invasive technologies like browser fingerprinting. We're in the process of deprecating third-party cookies and a whole lot more. But we also want to help publishers create great content and help merchants connect with their customers. That helps companies and developers develop new tools so that they can have thriving digital businesses as well. But getting that multi-sided balance right is critical for the open web. So we knew that we needed to put our engineers to work. Last year, we started something called the Privacy Sandbox, which builds out new internet standards, working with folks from all sides, online publishers, ad tech companies, advertisers, developers, and more. In some ways, it's like developing software. It's an agile and iterative process. You've heard launch and iterate. It's a form of privacy, not just privacy by design, privacy through innovation. But because the Privacy Sandbox effort is at the intersection of privacy and competition, it's no surprise that regulators had questions. We knew that we needed to lean in, commit resources and product teams to explain the goals, the processes, and why these were uniquely privacy-preserving technologies. So to respond to questions from the UK, we work with the authorities governing both competition on the one hand and privacy on the other. So we had experts representing both equities at the table who could hear from all the different constituencies, discuss the overlapping issues, and chart a reasonable path forward. As a result of those conversations, we committed to regular updates and conversations with the Competition and Markets Authority, the CMA in the UK, as well as the ICO, the Information Commissioner's Office, as we implement the Privacy Sandbox proposals. And by consulting with UK regulators during the development phase, we can make the necessary changes to the internet privacy standards up front, not waiting until something goes wrong and having to react. So the Privacy Sandbox story and the example set by the UK regulators is an example of how businesses need to not just lean into regulation, but really roll up our sleeves to proactively work through the impacts with the appropriate oversight bodies. But if that's a story about how regulators created an agile and a holistic process that brought together the best of tech and government, my second story relates to a governance challenge that was unique to the information age, and that's moderating content at scale, and how the private sector can help addressing the tensions and align among various services. So this story starts a few years ago, back in 2017, at the UN General Assembly in New York, where I had the remarkable privilege of speaking alongside the prime ministers of the UK and Italy and the president of France. I was there in my capacity as the first chair of what was then the brand new Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism. You'll remember that terror attacks had very recently rocked the underground in London, the Bataclan in Paris, and there was a real concern about terrorists abusing internet services around the world to both to terrorize and to organize and to recruit new members. We at Google had acted quickly to remove harmful material, but we also quickly realized that this is a problem that went way beyond any one company's platforms. Even if we identified and removed something from our services, bad actors could quickly repost it to Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitch or other platforms, forcing each company's teams to re-identify and take separate action, doing their own independent reviews. So the tech companies quickly realized that we needed to work collectively to deal with a collective problem. So across big companies and small ones, we worked with governments to identify and tackle extremist content as soon as it appeared online. We formalized that cooperation by creating the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, the GIFCT. And under the umbrella of the GIFCT, we developed a system to share digital signatures called hashes of content that we could share between companies. Since that speech at the UN, the GIFCT has evolved and it's now become a fully staffed, independent NGO with 18 different member companies. So stepping back for a second, why is extremist content or misinformation, why is that such a hard policy challenge to deal with? Well, part of the answer is that the digital world has an extraordinary range of different platforms and varying content problems. Hate speech, misinformation can look really different on a platform like Wikipedia, a social media platform, or a service like Google Maps. And of course, there's a huge range of social perspectives on that kind of, on problematic content, on different legal and cultural norms, freedom of speech and expression I spoke about a moment ago, that impact the global regulatory environment. Our experience reinforces the value of industry being able to step up to create solutions that are nimble and tailored to meet new, rapidly evolving and complex challenges. So we've seen this not just in our work with the GIFCT, but with the Tech Coalition, which is building tools to deal with child exploitation, and the Trusted Cloud Initiative working on security standards. The most recent cross-industry effort is the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership, the DTSP, which Google joined last year. The DTSP is a first-of-its-kind content moderation initiative, an independent body working to develop standards and best practices that can scale for small, medium, and large platforms, each with different values and business models. And I'm pleased to see that the executive director of the DTSP is actually here with us today to join in this conversation. It's part of the answer to the central question I highlighted earlier. How do we best design governance for the information age? So GIFCT, DTSP, and the other groups show that the private sector has an important role to play in helping governments developing frameworks that are aligned and interoperable. And that takes me to my third and last story. The achievement that only governments could have pulled off. So few issues out there illustrate the need for aligned approaches better than the value of global data flows. As many of you know, the US and the EU have worked for years to develop a framework that would permit the transatlantic exchange of data in ways that comply with the General Data Protection Regulation. Failure would have been a disaster. It would have changed how millions, maybe billions of people rely on the internet for the global exchange of information in their daily lives. Things like online shopping, or travel, or business operations, or security. Those data flows require trust. Trust between individuals and companies, that people's rights are protected if data is transferred to a different country, and trust between countries, that rights are protected and data is being shared for appropriate law enforcement purposes, and assurances that there's redress if consumer rights aren't respected. Companies on their own can't create that level of trust. Without a durable political solution, fragmented global data flows risk a splintered internet, which could slow or even stop innovation in AI, quantum, and other emerging technologies. The negotiations between the US and the EU on this issue came down to the wire, and they could well have failed. We, like many of you here, celebrate the hard work done by the European Commission and the US government to reach agreement on the new transatlantic data security framework, data privacy framework, excuse me. It was an important win, but a broader global conversation, part of this conversation, has barely begun. If we want to maintain a global internet, we are going to need governments to work with the same urgency to forge a broader global consensus around trusted data flows and flexible, interoperable regulations. Regulations that protect privacy and competition, but also promote high-quality content and our increasingly digital economies. So today's policymakers have a chance to develop frameworks for data flows that could be as important as Bretton Woods was for global finance. That's an exciting opportunity, but it's also an urgent challenge. Countries need to prioritize the work of building aligned interoperable regulations to help spread the benefits of technological innovation. The launch just last week of the Global Cross-Border Privacy Rules Forum is a welcome addition to the conversation on ensuring these kinds of stable, enduring rules around global data transfers. So to sum up, the democratic work of designing regulatory frameworks that support innovation is tough, it's complex, it requires hard trade-offs, and it's often thankless work. But it will help us promote the spread of technologies that raise global living standards and help us address our biggest global challenges. That kind of cooperation is going to take compromise, and I'm encouraged by the progress toward international coordination. The OECD's leadership on international corporate tax reform is a great example. Of course, we all have a role to play. You know, I said Google, we're often at our best when we have the lobbyists and the lawyers get out of the way and the engineers and the technologists take the lead in engaging with governments around the world. And those teams are excited to work with regulators to do a better job of explaining the tools we will, but also working through how best to use those tools to address urgent social challenges. Working together, we are confident that we can arrive at a governance framework that's fit for the information age, one that supports innovation, and one that makes people better off, more secure, and more empowered. Thanks very much.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Gold with Axios. I cover tech policy. I'm happy to be here with Kent Walker today. We've chatted before, and it's an exciting time in tech policy. A lot more has happened the past couple years or so than it was happening when I first started on the beat. It's a good time to chat and catch up.
You were ahead of your time.
Yeah, I want to talk about timing a little bit here. This is something you and I have talked about a little. Why is this conversation important to have now when we've seen some laws already be finalized in the UK, in the EU, laws on maybe the brink of being passed here in the US? Why is this the right time for the conversation?
I think it's an extraordinarily important time for the conversation. Sometimes it takes the development of potential new action to catalyze and crystallize a response to make sure that we're acting in thoughtful ways. So while Europe has passed the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, there's also a process of regulatory dialogue that's envisioned there, where people will have the opportunity to talk through, work through exactly how many of those rules should apply in practice. And those are many of the key details that are important that, as we make sure we're building an ecosystem that works for European consumers, businesses, other platforms. Stepping back, making sure we're thinking about the trade-offs that we were talking about, or I was talking about a moment ago, I think makes great sense. You know, as we launch and iterate this new round of regulation, and as we interpret and figure out what the next step should be.
And is this a conversation that you would all wish happened maybe a couple years ago before people started putting pen to paper?
Well, there's the old saying that the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. So we welcome the conversation whenever it happens. We've been urging this thoughtful consideration of these issues for a while, and those have been constructive conversations, and we hope to build on that.
Can you point to any examples, other than the ones you just pointed out, of where agile governance is happening in the tech sphere? And specifically, were there any times recently where you were sort of hoping to see that happen and it didn't, such as with the DMA or other things happening in the US?
Yeah, I think we've been clear that some of the provisions of the DMA or the DSA will be challenging, and we'll be working with regulators to try and interpret them in the most constructive way we can. But there are also positive examples of, I pointed to a couple, the UK CMA experience with Sandbox, or the fact that the new Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council is starting to forge a new transatlantic alliance around data that could be very constructive going forward. And of course, there are other countries around the world. Singapore is one that's been a leader in thinking through digital governance, et cetera. So I think there are a lot of positive models to look to.
Mm-hmm. Let's bring this back to regular folks that use technology platforms every day for a bit. Why is the concept of agile governance something that should be important to a consumer of Google products, for example?
Well, in many ways, as we're thinking about how to regulate the behind-the-scenes questions of vertical integration, how do we combine our services in a way that help users, or privacy protection, how do we make sure that defaults are set appropriately to protect people's privacy and keep their data secure, those will have big impact in people's everyday convenience, their ability to use all the different services from, I just came out from California, and on the way I checked in online, I went through TSA pre-check, I was able to use a ride-sharing service, I was able to even check the traffic using Google Maps. All of those services use user data in different ways to create great convenience for users, but you also want to make sure that your information is in good hands. So how do we have a robust regulatory framework that gives people the confidence that they're not going to suffer challenges even as they take advantage of the possibilities?
I want to talk about this conflict between privacy and competition that we're seeing play out in conversations around the DMA and other proposed laws, having to share information with competitors, if you're a designated gatekeeper, things like that. Are you at all worried about privacy implications of the DMA, should it go into effect as intended?
It's an important issue and one that we're going to continue to discuss with regulators in Europe. Just to put it in a nutshell, instead from a competition perspective, there's a desire to share lots of information so that rivals can have access to all the same information that any other company does. From a privacy perspective, there's a suggestion that companies should keep information close, precisely because of the risk that personalized information or information that could be de-anonymized gets shared with third parties that the original consumer never authorized. Though you can reconcile those issues, but there are trade-offs, and you need to have a thoughtful, holistic conversation, similar to the CMA and ICO conversation, about how different countries want to draw those lines. So we want to be careful that, not to say you have to choose between privacy and competition, that's clearly not the case. But it is important to have both in mind as you're thinking through these issues, and for regulators to be talking with each other, to understand how they can reconcile both of those issues and other issues as well. I alluded to the notion of responsible content moderation, but also free expression as another pairing that's challenging. The world of artificial intelligence has lots of areas where we are working our way through a variety of principles. We put out our AI principles in 2017, 2018. The easy thing to do is put out principles. The harder thing to reconcile is when those principles come in tension. And how do you make the decisions of which one are you favoring in which circumstance?
Can you point me to some other industries where you think this has occurred, where you've seen good examples of agile governance and industry and government working together to come to some sort of really good functional conclusion about regulations? Any other industries that you would take as an example?
Not that immediately come to mind, but it's a good question, in part because of the uniqueness of digital and the speed of evolution. Many of the other industries that we allude to here that are heavily regulated have been with us for 100 or hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. And so they have gone through this process, but it's almost a question of history. I mean, Cass alluded to the rise of regulation in the progressive era, and that first iteration of notice and comment as a regulatory innovation, allowing more refined regulations to occur. So in a sense, what I'm suggesting today is we need to go even beyond a notice and comment to notice and engagement, if you will, and to keep pace with the pace of digital.
So one of the only, truly comprehensive digital laws that we've seen pass in the past 5 to 10 years is Gdpr. So that's something we actually have in practice that is enforced today. Is that agile? Is that working in an agile way? What lessons learned from GDPR?
Well, I think the core goal of GDPR to make sure that people had consistent expectations across Europe around privacy is a laudable one. we would have been encouraging the US government to also adopt a federal privacy law that would keep us from having 50 different state laws as a patchwork of different privacy protections in different places, which wouldn't necessarily improve overall confidence in the digital ecosystem. So the direction of travel is a helpful one. Now, if you look at the GDPR, there are also a number of things that are challenging, even frustrating for consumers, having to click on many different consent buttons to authorize access to different sorts of information, a relatively narrow definition of what are legitimate interests for processing data, even if that processing helps everyday users and is within their general sense of expectation of what's reasonable for a company to do. So, there are obviously a number of different regulatory frameworks out there. I mentioned the cross-border privacy regulations, cross-border privacy rules framework that was just announced among sort of the US, Canada, various countries in the Asia Pacific. So I think there are different ways to go. The United States will inevitably go its own direction here. We hope it's a way that it progresses and progresses in a way that's interoperable and broadly consistent, but it doesn't need to be a cookie cutter.
Yeah, I mean, something I hear about a lot is the pop-ups and how consumers hate the pop-ups and they're just clicking through so they can get to wherever they're going. And that's a complaint I've heard a lot about the DMA. So I imagine when Google engages in the regulatory dialogue that we were talking about before, is that something you're going to be talking about? And do you guys have better ideas for how those notifications to consumers should be shared if it's not a pop-up?
Yeah, in many ways our job here is not to propose any particular answer, but to help expand the solution set, the range of things that regulators can be considering as they're looking at how to finesse questions, which may seem black and white, but in some cases there may be an interesting technological solution that allows you to eat your cake and have it too. So, as we go through this, we're talking about the idea of responsible data practices. So as we've learned from experience and challenges we've had in the past. So we now have privacy design documents we do when we launch new products that use user information. We conduct privacy reviews that hold ourselves accountable for making sure we're using information in responsible ways. Those kinds of things could be elements of a privacy law, but Congress right now is in the middle of those conversations, and we're rooting from the sidelines, and we're very much hoping they succeed.
Is Google able to engage in agile governance conversations with US Congress right now? Is this possible, given the current environment?
Yeah, look, it's no secret that it's a challenging time to get anything through Congress, but there are moments where you see the green shoots of bipartisan cooperation. Privacy is an issue where 75% of the American people believe we need clear regulation of how consumer data is being processed. It's not a partisan issue by any stretch. There are procedural issues about exactly how you would enforce a law. But if you look at Senator Cantwell, Senator Wicker, they've both introduced proposals that have a remarkable degree of overlap on a lot of the substantive issues at the heart of this question. So that gives us some reason for hope. And we hope that we could even make progress this year.
Let's talk about sort of the international stage of internet regulation, what we're seeing in places like Russia, China, India, and the war in Ukraine. Obviously, there's a lot of global instability, especially on the information front. Why is this concept of agile governance important to apply now, given all the instability going on in the war and what you've seen with digital services?
Well, I think it's particularly important as an opportunity for democracies to come together. And we've already started to see some of this. We've talked about a couple of the proof points earlier on. But that Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council is really important as a signal and beyond a signal on the substance of trying to think through how do two of the largest markets in the world work together to promote innovation, which has been such a core strength of democracies. So it is a crisis in the war in Ukraine. We and other platforms have taken dramatic steps to step up and prioritize high quality information and demote and remove misinformation from our services in unprecedented ways, where we and other companies are stepping up with humanitarian relief, with product fixes, launching air raid alerts and various other tools to protect Ukrainian governments and civilians who are at risk. But stepping back, I was at the Munich conference 2 months ago before the war broke out, in February now, maybe 3 months. I had never felt in recent years such a feeling of alignment between Europe and the United States on these issues. And that's a crucial ingredient in making sure that we all get this right.
Going back to regulators and policymakers and the sort of expectation that if they're going to engage in these conversations and make really smart, iterative laws, they have to have sort of a certain level of expertise or knowledge about the space that maybe they don't have. So how do you sort of square that with, who we've got in office and what we expect them to know, to be able to do a really good job on this?
Look, and this is not meant as a knock on regulators, it's meant as a comment on the fast evolving nature of the space. So one example is that in 1984, the United States had never authorized software patents. In 1984, the Supreme Court changed that policy and for the first time allowed software to be patented. That led to a rush of claims to the patent office with fairly low quality patents, but the patent examiners didn't necessarily have a background in software. And so a lot of low quality patents got through that had to be cleaned up over the years in litigation, patent troll fights, et cetera. So we need to find ways to resource our regulators to make sure that they have the ability to stay up to speed on this complex and fast evolving area, and to hire the technologists who can open the hood, who can engage with the teams, the engineers who are actually doing this work in the private sector, to understand the trade-offs that we're making and to convey the trade-offs that they want to see us make as decided by different democracies. So it's a critical opportunity and necessity for regulators, I think, to be able to double down in some of these areas.
Before we go to audience and iPad questions, I'm just going to throw a general question at you. What is Google's biggest challenge this year on the regulatory front?
Oh, wow.
The one that keeps you up at night the most.
No, that's, well, given how much I travel, I'm not sure what night is anymore. I think conversations are shifting right all around the world. We've talked about the DMA and DSA in Europe, but there are actually more regulations coming down the path with regard to AI, with regard to e-privacy regulation. That continues to be a very active conversation, both at the European level and the UK has a new online safety bill that they're proposing. France, so we're working through the work with publishers. So an awful lot going on there. The United States, as you alluded to, is considering both the possibility of a privacy bill, which is very exciting, and a variety of other bills which would regulate in different, in some ways inconsistent ways, with the notion of privacy, the global competition we're having. They're positive bills, USICA, the Endless Frontiers Act, the Compete Act, goes by different names, but it's designed to help American companies be more competitive in the global environment. I think that'd be a very welcome development. And then, of course, around the world, from Korea to Japan to South America, there's also an awful lot of activity. So we're very much engaged in trying to make sure that those laws benefit the entire digital ecosystem and citizens around the world. But it's discussion that's happening in many places and many fronts.
Great, thank you. We're going to move on to some questions that the audience sent in. We've seen a lot of attention on the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. What is Google hoping to see happen in the next meeting in Paris?
So the TTC has been obviously involved in some of the issues we've talked about so far. I think front and center right now is going to be the war in Ukraine and figuring out how the two regions continue their significant alignment on this. The European Commission, for example, has issued various sanctions against Russian disinformation, misinformation. The United States has focused on economic sanctions in different ways. Making sure that there's alignment there and consistency, I think, is very important. It's an example of the two countries, two regions, working in tandem to deal with an urgent problem. It is on Europe's doorstep, but it's obviously of deep concern to the United States. So I think that's probably going to take the bulk of the focus. Some of these other issues, alignment on privacy, figuring out how best to deal with some of the content moderation question, I think probably eventually we'll get there. But Ukraine is almost certainly going to be front and center.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You've talked about a need to recalibrate how regulators and businesses interact, but what does that look like in practice, and do we need new regulatory bodies?
Well, I think our focus has been really achieving what's in front of us, because the entire economy is becoming a digital economy. That if you think of 4 or 5 large companies with different services and different business models, one that is a focused on retail, one that's focused on enterprise software, one that's focused on social networks, ourselves that are focused on search, et cetera, et cetera. Those are already significantly different. And then when you add to that, virtually every major company is digitizing in different ways, using information in new ways to make itself more efficient, both with the United States and globally. The notion that a single regulator could sweep in all of that seems fairly daunting. I think the more practical short-term model is how do we get more digital expertise among all the existing regulators that are out there who have decades or maybe hundreds of years of experience regulating banking and pharma and aerospace and on and on. And pass legislation that's focused on the specific things like privacy that are very tangible and where there's a clear and present need to get the ball across the goal line.
I think that sort of flows into this question. What is the specific role of tech companies in making sure these governments and regulators get the rules right? Because you talk about you don't want to present exact solutions, but sort of introduce the idea that there are many solutions. So is it tech companies' roles to write proposed legislation, to give suggestions about tech specifically? Like, can you be a little more specific about what it might look like in practice?
Yeah. So we want to be a resource for providing technical experience to share the benefits of our experiences and sometimes our mistakes. Also to help people tease through the unexpected consequences of some of these new laws. Because when you go into a new area, it's to be expected that sometimes you're not going to think through the second or third order impacts, which may not be all that clear. So talking that, well, we could do X, but if we did X, think about Y or Z, I think is a contribution to the conversation that we can contribute to, other tech companies can contribute to. But same is true of academics and NGOs, really having this wide stakeholder conversation. So we're thinking about the national security impacts, the impacts on global competition, impacts on privacy and competition, as we talked about earlier, the impacts on content moderation and the free expression side of things. This is a complicated ball of twine. You start to pull on one side, you realize that everything is connected in different ways.
Mm-hmm. And before we wrap up, were there any audience questions before we go? Yeah.
Okay.
I think we are at time then. Thank you so much, Ken, for this interesting conversation. Right. And yeah, thanks for joining us today.
I'm Rick Johnston. I'm the chair of business at OECD. I'm going to suggest you all stand up because you've been sitting for a while and it'd be good to stretch a bit. But don't leave, okay? It's not... I made the fatal mistake of drinking some of the spa water over there, and I think it's getting sleepy. What a glorious venue, huh? This is the first time I've been in here. It's just amazing. All right, stretch this way, stretch that way. All right, folks, let's get going. As I said, good afternoon. I'm Rick Johnston. I chair business at OECD. My day job is as head of international government affairs for Citibank here in Washington. First, I want to thank Jacobo Ramos-Folk, who is our staff person from BIAC. He's been a real help in setting this up, very, very helpful for me. And by the way, if anything in my remarks disturb you, it's his fault, not mine. Many thanks, too, to Ken Walker for those really good remarks that help us, I think, draw a real important focus on the theme of the strengthening of the dialogue between government and business. As chair of business at OECD, it's a pleasure to welcome you. That's my primary task. To this symposium on Agile Governance that we're co-organizing with OECD and George Washington University. After the stress caused by the pandemic, it's great to have an actual in-person event with an actual live audience. So congratulations to all of us, I think, on that. We live in times of incredible uncertainty in world affairs. Consider that in the last 20 years, we've experienced a full-scale global war on terror, a global financial crisis, 2 recessions, a pandemic that knows no boundaries, trade wars and hybrid warfare that challenges the sovereignty of states, climate change that is testing our abilities to collaborate at the multilateral level, and now a war with geopolitical and geoeconomic consequences that are shaking the world order and our daily lives. In this environment, the OECD has taken on renewed relevance as an international institution dedicated to helping governments manage the difficult task, and I want to underscore this word, recovery. Much like its original purpose in helping Europe recover its economic and democratic footing following World War II. Today, the organization is looked to for empirical research and analysis that will help governments adopt policies and practices that will nurture and strengthen the real economy. And that's another part of what BAC does that is so important. We bring the perspective of the real economy to the OECD. This role requires constant vigilance and adaptation to recognize and guide governments and the private sector in the regulation and support of the real economy, which today is so heavily affected by technology and innovation. Now, we have to admit that this topic of regulatory agility, the need for cross-border regulatory coherence, indeed, simply the need for regulatory certainty in uncertain times, is a pretty boring topic for most politicians, and I'll be kind, some regulators. Indeed, it's too often a topic that they actually push away, seeing it as a threatening change in regulatory mandates, or acquiring attention to conditions like cybersecurity or carbon pricing that are not familiar topics and that present, for some, a very steep learning curve. That's why I so admire and appreciate the work of the OECD. Its Regulatory Policy Committee has done incredibly important work and work on a really persistent issue. I was commenting before we started the program to one of my friends on the side. I've been doing this now for 50 years. I know, I don't look at it. But ever since the get-go of my career here in Washington, this single topic of regulation and the need for certainty in the business environment has always been the primary concern and the primary problem. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us in the business community to recognize that we have to remain persistent. You give up on this topic, and our colleagues in the government will more or less consider it to be, okay, taken care of, not a big deal. So we have to continue to persist. We may want to tweak it a bit in terms of how we present it, but we've got to continue to press for regulatory coherence, regulatory cooperation, and very, very importantly, that essential business and government dialogue that goes to really agile regulation and intelligent regulation. As many of you know, business at OECD is the officially recognized business voice at the OECD, and we know firsthand how the before-mentioned global challenges affect business operations around the world with deep impact on the real economy. Through our member national business organizations, business at OECD provides a voice in OECD deliberations for over 7 million enterprises worldwide. Knowing the topic to be so crucial to the operation of the real economy, we particularly welcome the main theme of today's symposium, the OECD's Council recommendation on Agile governance that was approved in October of last year. As co-organizers of today's program, we publicly support this recommendation since it recognizes that innovation fosters economic growth and that it must not be constrained by an overly restrictive regulatory environment. We know that the private sector is the main driver of innovation and technological change, since being at the forefront of innovation enhances the competitive advantage of a business in times of increasing competition. Furthermore, Agile governance also enables greater experimentation and testing to stimulate innovation under regulatory supervision. It promotes cross-sector and multi-jurisdiction experimentation initiatives to provide businesses with an environment that can enhance regulatory cooperation and promote interoperable regulatory frameworks. My God, Jacobo, that was a lot of words. But true. Another key component of the OECD Agile Governance recommendation is its emphasis on engaging with stakeholders to create more comprehensive public policies with a minimum of unintended consequences. Hence, we believe that it is essential that business should be considered on a, business's voice be considered on a systematic basis, not ad hoc. Finally, I wanted to note that this year, Business at OECD is celebrating its 60th anniversary. It's almost as old as I am. 60 years ago, BAC was established based on a fundamental tenet that has stood the test of time: the need to bring public and private sectors together to support free market and private enterprise in a democratic system that generates and distributes prosperity. In fact, the need for constant dialogue between entrepreneurs and policymakers has grown stronger and more important over the years as the operation of the real economy becomes more complete, complex, and intertwined. Whether it's to fight a pandemic, to make trade and investment work for growth and inclusion, or to advance development in emerging economies, public-private dialogue and partnerships are critical to good governance. And the only way to drive them forward is through frank conversations between business and governments that can enhance trust, innovative thinking, and consensus. Trust, innovative thinking, and consensus. This is what we do best collectively at Business at OECD, and it's the focus of our mission for the years ahead. Business advocacy matters. Now let me pass the floor on to a panel of expert government officials working to put Agile regulation into practice. I invite them up to the stage now, and want to also introduce Maureen Ulhausen, who will serve as the moderator of the panel. Maureen is a stellar career, had a stellar career at the FTC. She's head of the Baker Boss Law Firm, Global Antitrust and Competition Practice. And she chaired for a while, acting as chair and also as a commissioner of the FTC. It was because of her exceptional performance at the FTC that the commissioner received the prestigious Pitofsky Lifetime Achievement Award for her contribution to the commission. So with that, thank you very much. Welcome again. Really do appreciate your showing up. And over to you, Maureen.
Great. Thanks so much, Rick. Thank you. Please. Well, welcome everyone to the policymakers panel. I get to speak as a former policymaker, and I'm delighted to be joined. And so we'll have 4 speakers, 2 in person and 2 virtual. We'll have Tina Green, who is the Assistant Secretary for Regulatory Affairs for the Treasury Board of the Canada Secretariat. We'll have Susana Cordero Guerra, who's Manager, Institution for Development, Inter-American Development Bank, in person. Dominic Mancini, also in person, Deputy Administrator of the Office of Management and Budget's Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, I think better known as OIRA. And then Katrine Winding, who will be virtual, who's the Director General of the Danish Business Authority. So I'm delighted to be moderating this panel, and I think I don't need to reiterate what all the speakers have said earlier today about the enormous challenges that are facing business and government for coming up with regulatory responses to the myriad problems and challenges and fantastic possibilities that we're facing today. And the challenge of having regulations keep up with innovation and support growth while also making sure that they manage risk and guarantee that populations broadly benefit from all these great developments. When I was a commissioner, I wrote an article, and I used to be a policymaker and got to pop off on these things. I wrote an article called The Procrustean Problem with Prescriptive Regulation. And Procrustes was a Greek god who greeted travelers. He provided them a bed. But the catch was that he either stretched the traveler to fit the bed, or if they were too tall or too long, he kind of chopped off limbs to fit them in. And it's a bit of a warning about trying to take complex issues and apply a very simple or too simple one-size-fits-all framework to it. And in this article, I talked about two ideas, which is one, understanding for regulators, they need to understand the limits of our own knowledge as regulators and the ability to predict where things are going. And also a recommendation to focus on substantial harm, because often when there's new technologies, there's all this fear and skepticism and concern about what does this all mean. And it's kind of amusing to go back in time and you look at the concerns about electricity and the concerns about phones and the concerns about, what have you. So to really focus on the harms. So I'm delighted that in our panel today, we're going to discuss how countries have already taken steps with the intention of making governance and regulatory approaches more agile and flexible and resilient. For example, through the development of anticipatory approaches, the use of experimental regulation, such as regulatory sandboxes, and as illustrated by the creation of Agile nations, the promotion of international coordination across regulators. Maybe I'll invite Dominic, if you would, to present OIRA's views on the impact of COVID-19 on the governance and the regulatory challenges faced by government.
All right,
yes,
please,
okay. Please.
All right, thank you, and I'll be very brief. And before I start, though, I just wanted to comment on this amazing venue. It's the first time I've been here, and also to comment maybe for our international colleagues. We are actually overlooking Teddy Roosevelt Island. That is also represents a very interesting time in the history of the U.S. government to think about the relationship between government and governance of the American people and businesses. So I just wanted to point that out for the folks that have traveled to get here. Thanks. I'll be extremely brief. And plus, one of my former bosses that is here, Cass, actually stole some of the thunder talking about our memo that we put together, and I have to maybe thank him. I'm going to hear scat a lot more in the near future. So, gee, I don't know if that's a thanks or a sorry or what, but I'll definitely let him hear about that. So, a couple overarching themes that I want to tie all these things together, because I want to mention a couple other things besides that, again, very briefly. Probably heard this from me, you've heard this from OIRA, avoiding unnecessary differences, avoiding unnecessary burdens, and avoiding maybe perhaps unanticipated burdens, although that's hard to predict, as we heard before. Second, like to think more expansively about the term regulation. A lot of these things, this is OIRA. Anytime that the government is asking the public to do something, be it filling out forms for benefits, encouraging the private sector, requiring the private sector. We're trying to think regulation and burden is more expansive in this office. A little known fact of OIRA is actually our authorities under the Paperwork Reduction Act for administrative burden, that might be called in OECD, are what really created this office, and we do have the strongest authorities. So let me get to the COVID. I guess the short answer is yes, we're looking at what we've learned during COVID. It was a wonderful natural experiment, also a very tragic natural experiment, but let's see what we can learn about that. Many things, the apocryphal example is telehealth, but there are many things in which the government really reassessed what needs to happen in order to qualify for a benefit. For instance, in the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, during the pandemic, the administration, both administrations, eliminated requirements for in-person interviews, moving verification processes online and telephone, extended certification, the whole 9 yards. We would really like the agencies to take a whole government approach to looking at what works and what doesn't, what's necessary and what's not in terms of benefits programs. Again, in government, this will mean a lot, maybe not for those out, but OMB recently issued what's called an M memo, which is the most serious type of bureaucratic memo coming from OMB. directing agencies to better account for and reduce paperwork burdens to access public benefits. This is really it really is tied to the equity agenda of this administration. But we are looking for greater public consultation to just figuring out what works and what doesn't. These are benefits that folks are legally entitled to, and we do think that the government has an obligation to minimize the burdens necessary to apply and qualify for those benefits. And so we're looking at many other areas, but I wanted to focus that in the short version. You'll hear from our partners in Canada soon, hopefully, cross our fingers, about international regulatory cooperation, but I will also mention, maybe I'll leave it to her to talk through the specifics, but again, avoiding unnecessary differences. Two mature regulatory countries, probably as they develop regulations over the years, there's lots of those small decisions that regulators need to make that if you just talk to each other, you could coordinate those and make it much easier for businesses and other stakeholders in the private sector and individual citizens to interact across borders. And what I mentioned, thinking that regulation encompassing more than just standard setting, thinking about cooperation on all aspects of international cooperation, be it joint inspections, be it joint application processes, all the way up through standards and data sharing from one to the other. Lastly, I just really wanted to briefly mention, but probably don't have time to get into it, we have done a lot of thought about emerging technology. And again, talking about avoiding unnecessary differences. OIRA recently put out artificial intelligence regulatory principles. I don't want to get into the details, but I would want to send what the first principle is public trust. Second principle is transparency. So really, when we're talking about agile regulation, I wanted everyone to keep that in mind, what the ultimate goal of that is, be it getting rid of the sludge, as Cass says, for application of benefits, thinking about unnecessary differences internationally, and thinking about as technologies emerge, keeping that in mind that the ultimate goal is for the public to maintain trust in the government doing its job about regulation. So I don't know what things will look like in 5 years, but if they do, I would hope that things are easier to apply for. There's less burden maintaining the sovereignty of each country to regulate, but less burden across the borders and thinking about a rational approach to emerging technology. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dominic. So now I'm going to look back at our tech people. Are we ready for? Yes. All right. Katrine Winding, thank you so much. Delighted to have you, Katrine. If you would give us your views on what Denmark is doing to develop agile rulemaking for innovation.
I will make it short and sweet. This is, I just have to say, starting out, this is really something that is close to my heart as a regulator. If we want to tackle the big issues, the big problems that we're facing, we need to work on a more agile and innovative regulation. This is where we become relevant and competent. So we need to make it fit for future, fit for purpose, and mitigating the risks and the unintended consequences. So just mentioning quickly two initiatives that we have taken in Denmark. First is on new regulation, where we are just about to launch an innovation entrepreneur check on all new relevant business regulation, meaning that we will, at an early stage in the policy cycle, we've been given the mandate in the Danish Business Authority to initiate dialogue with the relevant authorities on the regulation, the business regulation that they're conceiving, in order to make recommendations as to how make it more innovation and entrepreneur friendly. This is building on some principles that we have already had in place for some years now on agile regulation. What we've learned is that it's crucial to be part of the policy discussion from an early stage. It's also crucial that we have the mandate to actually tackle the issue of innovation. And it's a very good starting point, having this mandate. But when it comes down to it, it's also, it's very much, as we've heard, of course, stakeholder engagement, dialogue with businesses, but it's also a culture that you have to have across all ministries and authorities, where you actually are interested and you share knowledge and information on how to actually do this. How do you actually make regulation that is fit for purpose and for future? It's not just done by principles and mandates. So that is one thing, and a very close coordination, information sharing, inspiration from each other. That would be one thing. On existing regulation, we experienced that a lot of entrepreneurs, startups, companies with new business models actually don't know whether their business model is compliant with existing regulation, because it is by nature cross-sectoral, cross-border. This is where we have set up a one-stop shop for new business models, where you can reach out and have a coordinated and swift reply from all relevant authorities on a business model. It is sometimes it's big, sometimes it's small. We've helped a lot of companies through this one-stop shop solution. Just to mention one example of a company, a startup called Next Food. They wanted to sell a vertical farming solution where they would grow and harvest salad locally within the restaurants. So with vertical greenhouses. So this was a new example of a new business model of production and distribution of food. They didn't know what kind of regulation was relevant to them. Was it food production? Was it barn door sales regulation? So they had a swift reply from all authorities on how to go about this regulation, as well as an assessment of how the Danish Food Agency would actually assess their solutions, the vertical farming solutions in the restaurants, when they did their routine inspection of restaurants handling food. So, I mean, this is just a very small example, but it's also an example of how a swift reply on maybe rethinking existing regulation. You don't always have to make new regulation. You can also just tweak and administer it in a different way. So those were my two initial examples of things in Denmark.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate those very, the particular example was really made real, the idea, some of these broader principles. So I'm going to turn it over to Tina. And Tina, we would love to hear about Canada's efforts to foster regulatory cooperation, including across borders.
Thank you so much for the invitation today. Again, for me, it's a topic that's really important for regulators. We are and we should be in a continuous improvement mode in terms of looking to always hit that sweet spot in terms of having regulations that are flexible and agile, but that also offer enough sort of predictability and enough of a solid base for planning for us and also for external parties. And so in terms of a couple of things that we have underway, we've been undertaking over the course of the last few years targeted regulatory reviews. We've done 6 of these in different sectors. And a key element of those of that review that we're doing directly with stakeholders, so getting very concrete feedback from stakeholders to allow us to figure out where to focus our efforts. But a key element of that examination is really about looking to put in place more fit-for-purpose type rule sets to allow a better sort of regulatory frame for new and innovative products coming into the marketplace, and really in consideration of the global situation as well. So that certainly was the case for the Health and Biosciences review that we did, that generated a new approach with respect to drug approvals that resulted actually in COVID vaccine approvals through the pandemic. That was very much built on models established elsewhere internationally, which also allowed us as well to recognize vaccines approved in other jurisdictions. So it really did this, this legal instrument was really a facilitative tool to both allow us to iterate in terms of approving these products, but also to make sure that we are well aligned internationally to be able to benefit from the hard work of regulatory colleagues across the world. What I would also highlight is that in our position at Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, we are also the formal lead for 4 different regulatory cooperation tables. The oldest of these is the Regulatory Cooperation Council, where Dom and I are both heavily implicated. And that vehicle just hit the 11-year mark in February. And it has historically provided some great gains, in terms of having that type of focus, both from OIRA and also from the center of the Canadian federal system, to be able to get some really important issues over the line and to look to make our systems more coherent together. And so one example is that, for sunscreens that used to cross our border, that used to require very similar, almost identical testing, both in the US and in Canada. And so through the RCC work, we were able to eliminate that duplicative testing and also the quarantine that was required. And that saved companies, Canadian American companies, $100,000 per product. And so, beyond the economic gains, you certainly also get the opportunity, like Dom said, to be able to share expertise and share experience for these intractable issues in the form of the full regulatory life cycle. So from sort of the design and scoping out of regulatory issues, but then also on the delivery as well, with respect to being able to share inspections results in the pharmaceutical space. So the one other thing I'll highlight is that there is work underway between both the Canadian American government on supply chains currently. Already have been mentioned the importance about having resilient and secure supply chains. And I would just note that as this has been identified as a priority for both our Prime Minister and also for the US President, we are looking for areas where we can further advance regulatory cooperation principles in areas such as critical minerals, life sciences, and also in the electric vehicle and battery space as well. And then my last plug is that as of tomorrow, we are launching a new online engagement platform in the federal Canadian system called Let's Talk Regulations. And we are actually, our first intake is looking for ideas that could be worth pursuing through one of the 4 regulatory tables for which we are the lead. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Maureen.
Great. Thank you so much, Tina. And be really interested to hear what the response is to Let's Talk Regulations, because you may get some fantastic ideas that hadn't really come up through the traditional channels. So now I'm going to turn it over to Susanna and ask if you would highlight some of the challenges that IADB has identified to transform better regulation practices in the Latin American region.
So thank you, Maureen. Thank you to the organizers of the conference for the kind invitation to be here today. It's always a challenge to be the last one on a long day of discussions and to actually say something new. But I'm going to try to step up to this challenge with a personal story, and I'll be brief. But I think it dovetails with everything that we're talking about here and shows the importance of agile governance. And I think my role here, at least to complement all my colleagues that have spoken so far, is to highlight the developing country / state capacity aspects of implementing regulatory reform. And so where does the story come in? In my previous role as president of the National Statistical Agency in Brazil, it's a 12,000 person agency. I ran it during COVID, and it was a situation where we all ran on paper, and we were not connected to any government system. And we were responsible for GDP, inflation, unemployment, and all official statistics in the government. So if we didn't work or found a way to become agile overnight, we would have a statistical blackout. It was as simple as that. In 6 weeks, we had to reinvent ourselves and implement a digital transformation program, and we were able to not miss a beat. We were one of the 5 institutes in the world where we did not skip one data release. And how did that happen? We, first of all, were clients of the IDB, that I now run one of the divisions. And in this process, and as coming into the IDV and into this institution's department, you can see that there is a version of SCAT for state capacity. And if you think of it as an umbrella, I'd like to also choose 4 points. I don't have the acronym, but I have the 4 points. And the first one is that we need to embrace the problem as a whole, the complexity of the problem as a whole. It wasn't GDP, it wasn't inflation, it wasn't unemployment. It was thinking about how we could run and insert change and embed change in the culture of the organization overnight. A complex problem. And we had to embrace that problem as a whole and not in a fragmented way. And understand that to enable that transformation, we had to cater to build a coalition of purpose-driven individuals that wanted to solve these problems together. And understand another principle was that the organization builds capability by solving problems. And so we had to roll up our sleeves, get embedded into the problem and solve it ourselves. And we didn't have time for procurement, for bidding processes, for any of that. We had to find the talent within the organization. So looking at the problem as a whole, I would say relating to SCAT is really understanding the depth of sludge. The depth of sludge in terms of the entire organization and how to drive organizational reform. The second element would be driving transformation from inside outwards, as opposed to outwards inside. Usually you think of development and reform as a way in which you have these ad hoc reforms, either through IT, HR, procurement systems, digital, and they're somewhat segmented and fragmented. But in this case, how we're looking at it as the IDB as a whole, and how we drive state capacity across governments in Latin America, is not looking at hollow organizations, donut organizations, but filling in that capacity inside outwards, building that coalition, building that critical mass, and then from that purpose-driven element, having reform scale to the rest of the organization. The third element is one that has been talked upon by, I think, all of the panelists so far, is the aspect of iteration and adaptation. And here, and the element of doing it in real time and not being afraid to experiment, but having elements and accountability frameworks where people are able and professionals feel comfortable to experiment and comfortable with failure. And yet there is a way in which failure always translates into learning, which brings to the last point, which is an organization learns from doing, and then it does what it learns. And that's an element which, RCTs are wonderful when we have the gold standard of RCTs, but usually we don't have the luxury of a counterfactual. So being able to use all kinds of data, being qualitative, quantitative, and being able to merge them and complement them and extract the most value from these data sets, whatever they may be, to to engage in this real-time analysis and learning, I would say is the fourth key element in the solutions-driven approach that we're driving at the IDB in the Institutions for Development sector. And we see results in Mexico, in Peru, in Ecuador, in many countries, from regulations from fintech to capital markets, to debt regulation, to a series of examples in transparency and integrity elements. And so the department covers a plethora of themes, but they all have the connective tissue of institutions and the platform of state capacity, which I think is a conduit for regulatory change and reform. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry. So thank you, Susanna. It sounds like that sometimes the fact that you have to fly the airplane while you're still building it can be a great way to actually focus the mind and make things happen. So that was really wonderful, wonderful example. So we're running short of time, so we really won't be able to take any questions from the audience. But I did want to ask one question from the panelists who are here with me, and just if you wouldn't mind just talking briefly about how you foster societal buy-in for these great ideas and regulatory approaches that you're developing. So Susanna, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I'd say 3 points. It's important to bring everyone to the table, public and private sector, all the stakeholders involved. And I'd say, like the former speaker said, you have to lean into dialogue. I thought that was a great phrase, and I'd say that's a very important element. And how you do it, the form and the manner in which you do it is as important as the dialogue itself. So who gets invited, for how long? The devil is in the details in how that stakeholder engagement evolves. So I'd say that's the first point, and building that coalition. The second point is transparency, transparency, transparency. So in the statistical agency example, for example, in that case, being able to publish the data and publish the methodologies and go through them and being as clear as possible on any change that was being done was very critical. And I'd say for reform as it evolves, the same principle applies. And lastly, accountability, and being sure that the frameworks are in place and that there is a short accountability mechanism between the provider and the beneficiaries of that service, and having really a tight link between those two.
Dominic?
I agree. I will emphasize something very similar, is to make sure that the system actually is responsive to public interaction. One of the things that we've worked on with some folks in the audience is fake and mass commenting. And I think about the traditional ways. We've heard a lot theoretically about how the traditional notice and comment in the rulemaking context is maybe not the best approach, but very specifically, in any large rulemaking now in the United States, you have to deal with automated commenting, perhaps commenting you don't know the origin of, mass commenting, which is perfectly legitimate, but you have to be careful to have the capacity to actually deal with it. So I will say unequivocally, I believe that those individual stakeholders and individual comments are actually extremely important to the system, but we need to be constantly vigilant to make sure that our tools that we have accommodate that unique point of view and be in the openness to stakeholders. And I think that challenge is only going to get harder as the technology tools evolve. When we were actually talking about some of our, even something as mundane as doing the CAPTCHAs and automatic, to not so mundane as natural language processing and automatic categorization of comments, deduplication. Already we were seeing places where there's some academic research that suggested that you could make individualized comments that look indistinguishable from actual people. So I actually think that's an emerging thing that we really need to pay attention to. But more generally, all these things, the transparency, the responsiveness, I think we just have to be constantly vigilant to make sure the system itself is actually responsive to the comments and the interaction that we get from the public.
Well, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time for the panel. So please join me in thanking our wonderful policymakers for their great advice. And I think now we can turn it back to the organizers for the final word. Should we?
Very much.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Great panel. Thank you very much, everyone. So we have a couple more things on the agenda. Next, to introduce a civil society perspective, we're pleased to have Dr. Michael Mandel share some observations on the discussion. You'll notice Michael and I are over there madly making notes because the entire
afternoon.
Michael is chief economist and vice president of the nonprofit Progressive Policy Institute in Washington, where he supervises research on the economics of innovation and growth in both the public and the private sector. So he's perfect for some concluding remarks. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks very much, Susan. First, let me say I'm glad to not be virtual here today, in part because this is such a wonderful space. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C. I've never been in this space before, and it's really inspiring. So just take a moment if you haven't been here before, and just take a look around. It's terrific. The word progressive in PPI has two very different meanings. First, it means caring about protecting consumers, workers, and the environment. Second, it means moving forward economically. With this dual meaning, you will not be surprised that our main focus is growth and innovation, with special attention to the appropriate role of regulation. So I view the topic of agile regulation as a near and dear to our hearts. How can we bring regulation into the 21st century in a way that benefits ordinary people? Let me set the stage for my remarks. People say that we live in an era of rapid technological change, and that's certainly true. But it's also accurate to say that we live in a period of fundamental technological uncertainty where many things seem possible, but nothing is assured. And it's absolutely essential for regulators. That's the reason for agile regulation. Okay, if it was just that technological change was rapid, we could sort of put ourselves to the task of figuring out how to steer it and so forth. But we're in a world in which technological doors can open quickly, then close again. Autonomous vehicles, for example. Just a few years ago, the big fear that autonomous trucks would put millions of truck drivers out of work. But think about what's going on now. Now we have massive shortages of truck drivers, okay? In part because the shift to autonomous vehicles is turning out to be far more difficult than we expected, both technologically and also in terms of regulation. The role of regulation here is to accelerate and make sure that it happens, okay? On the other hand, and we've seen plenty of examples of innovations popping into regulatory scrutiny without warning, right? Went through the pandemic. The mRNA vaccine platform was languishing in a regulatory and scientific backwater for decades before the pandemic pushed it into public view. Now it's top of mind for a variety of different applications, including cancer treatments. And you know, no regulatory conference can be complete without a mention of cryptocurrency. So, I mean, despite having been invented in 2009, I should note that crypto was not mentioned once in the World Economic Forum's excellent December 2020 report, Agile Regulation for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Today, of course, the definition of an agile financial regulator is someone who can consider cryptocurrencies while sleeping well at night. So regulators, agile regulators, this is my definition of agile regulators. They have to be concerned about encouraging innovation at the same time they worry about potential negative impacts. They operate in a very dynamic environment where regulatory assumptions can suddenly be overturned by unexpected events or new technologies, okay? Some problems stay with us for a long time, others change very quickly. That means regulatory humility is essential. So I would like to make 3 points here. Not 4, okay? That's because Susan asked me to shorten my presentation. No, that's not true. That's not true, okay? First, agile regulators must be prepared for the goals of regulation to shift suddenly. We've obviously seen the pandemic caused pharmaceutical regulators around the globe to greatly accelerate their normal approval process for vaccines without losing sight of safety or efficacy. We need a retrospective analysis to see which agile regulatory adjustment strategies work the best so we can accelerate biotech innovation in the future in a way that benefits patients, especially in developing countries. There was also that mention of supply chain disruptions. You know, the supply chain disruptions and inflation, nobody worried about them before 2021, okay? Inflation had been dormant for many years, and global supply chains seemed to work really well. You know, you ordered something on the internet and it showed up. Who knew where it was coming from? It didn't really matter, okay? Now inflation has accelerated and regulators are considering whether rising prices are just a problem for central banks, whether other actions need to be taken as well. Here it's important for agile regulators to disaggregate the causes of inflation. In the US, inflation has been fueled by developments in the energy and auto sectors. Regulators need to consider carefully whether the transition to lower carbon energy and electric cars should be accelerated to deal with inflation, or whether that would make price increases worse. Meanwhile, okay, and this is obviously very relevant, the tech telecom sector in the US actually saw falling prices in 2021 as a result of heavy investment in new data processing and broadband capacity. That deflation may have some impact on how we think about tech regulation. That brings me to my second point. I was glad to see a government statistician on the previous panel. Agile regulators need better ways to track outcomes if they are to do a good job of rapidly adjusting to changing technologies. Government statisticians around the world do the best they can with the budgets they have. I've been trained over the years to say that sentence every time I talk about government statistics, okay? They're doing the best they can with the budget they have. But much more work is needed to provide a clear picture of emerging technologies, innovations, and problems. And you know, I need to just put in my plug for PPI. In December 2021, the Innovation Frontier Project of PPI held a conference on better statistics for better policy. That was a virtual conference. One issue that we considered was the role of sophisticated supply chains in today's global economies. Intricate global supply chains are a fairly recent innovation that could not exist without a steady flow of data between buyers and producers to coordinate the entire production web. Let me make an obvious statement, at least obvious to you who know the trade statistics. There are no trade statistics that tell us how much of trade is done through arm's length transactions and how much is done through supply chain agreements. That data doesn't exist because regulators didn't worry about this until the emergence of persistent supply chain disruptions. We don't have the right trade data to understand global supply chains and how they go wrong. We know the final country where the product was loaded onto the ship or plane, but we don't know which parts or materials come from which countries. If we are even going to try to address supply chain resilience, we need better information. We also need better statistics, and this should be obvious if we want to track prices in the digital sector. There's some evidence that inflation in e-commerce is lower than brick and mortar retail. Over the last year, for example, e-commerce margins, as reported by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, were flat, while margins in the total retail industry are up 15%. More work is necessary to understand these differences. My third and final point, and we're coming to the end of the day, obviously, which is good for all of us. Okay. Conventional regulation operates in silos, with each regulatory agency focusing on one aspect or industry. But an essential feature of agile regulation is tearing down regulatory silos. Someone has to be empowered to make big picture trade-offs between regulatory goals across agencies. Several years ago, the Progressive Policy Institute proposed the idea of a Regulatory Improvement Commission, or RIC for short, which would be a group of experts and wise heads given the task of looking across regulatory silos and deciding how to improve or trim regulations. A Regulatory Improvement Commission would be a way of institutionalizing an agile approach to regulation. When we designed the RIC, it was tailored for the US constitutional structure, but obviously similar institutions could be customized for other political systems. The key to agility here is to have a separate institution which has access to analysis, as Cass said, both prospective and retrospective from individual regulatory agencies, but with a broader scope. Let me end by noting that before I joined PPI, I was the chief economist at Business Week. We used to say that regulation was simply the most important subject that no one wanted to read about. I don't know if that's still true, but I'm certainly gratified to see all the attention being given to the subject of agile regulation today. Thank you for inviting me to participate.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. That was great. And we, as he says, we are getting close to the reception, but I had been planning to give you just a few minutes, my wrap up based on the day. So let me quickly do that before we go. So I've identified, I think, 3 themes. One is the importance of considering trade-offs. Ex-ante benefit cost analysis helps us consider those trade-offs in a transparent way, but it is not sufficient. As Maureen noted, there's no central authority that can have all the necessary knowledge. And as Michael just so eloquently said, we're in a time of fundamental technological uncertainty with sudden shifts, so regulators may not even know what they should be focusing on, what the next challenge will be. So respecting that uncertainty and the diversity of preferences and circumstances means we have to go beyond that, and I'm getting into some of Cass's SCAT. We must test, so that's Cass's T. Retrospective evaluation to calibrate ex-ante predictions, experimentation, smaller scale initiatives combined with measurement and rigorous learning. So we heard that from Cass and Kent and from Susanna. And the COVID experience, I think, does support that. Tina, I don't know if she's still listening to us, but and Dom both talked about the COVID experience, where the different government approaches provided a natural experiment for learning and adapting to new knowledge. So that measure and react that is part of the OECD recommendations is very important. The second theme, I think, is the importance of dialogue. Public commenting on rulemaking, Tina's Let's Talk Regs in Canada, working with industry to get the benefit of the technical expertise. That was a major point of Kent's remarks, I think. Engaging different expertise and perspectives at different levels of government, different industries, academia, civil society, to bring essential insights with respect to opportunities and challenges and the best ways to approach them. I think we heard from that from everyone. And then my third theme is actually a sense of optimism about the promise of innovation in the tech space and elsewhere to improve human well-being, be it health, environment. We heard that, I think, from the government panelists. Rick talked about the ability of free markets and private enterprise in a democratic system to generate and distribute prosperity. And Kent had a phrase, innovation is the secret weapon of democracies. The promise of innovation in the private sector, but also I really felt that in the public sector. This last panel, just great remarks about, Michael talked about tearing down silos, and that's something that I heard people on the previous panel talking about, the cultural, purpose-driven, problem-solving regulators. We heard that from our government panelists, Susan and Katrina, and the importance of transparency and accountability and responsiveness. So let's end this on an optimistic note. I'd like to just thank the co-organizers. We've been working together for months and only met each other today after Zoom screening, not Zoom, excuse me, Google Meeting for quite a while. But excellent team, an excellent team. So I won't thank you all individually, but OECD, BIAC, Google, World Economic Forum, USCIB, thank you.